Okay, so welcome, folks. Welcome to today's webinar from wherever you are gathering across the country. We're glad you're decided to spend some time with us today. The webinar, What's Next in the Fight Against Conversion Practices in Canada, where we're at 3 years after the ban. So today we'll be sharing learnings from CBC's Intersectoral Action Fund projects, IAF. You'll hear that later. Um, to establish a coalition to end conversion practices in Canada. My name is Jordan Sullivan. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I am the coordinator of the project, with which we'll be talking about today, and I'm currently the CP response coordinator at CBRC. I am a trans man and a survivor of religious-based conversion practices. I'm joining today from the traditional territory of the Michisagic and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. I live and work on this land from my home in Cobourg, Ontario. The community-based research center's work extends across Turtle Island. We acknowledge the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization on Indigenous peoples in this country. Indeed, Indigenous people have continued to experience conversion practices through colonization, as well as through the racist systems and institutions that continue to marginalize them. We at CBRC are committed to supporting truth, justice, decolonization, and reconciliation as essential parts of equity and inclusion for two-spirit, queer, trans, and non-binary people. Today's webinar will include presentations and conversations about conversion practices in Canada post-criminalization and feature perspectives from legal experts, survivors, advocates, and researchers. We offer this webinar to foster awareness and critical discussions on strengthening protections, ensuring accountability, and building a nationwide movement to end conversion practices once and for all. I just want to quickly review a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, we will have automated AI generated closed captioning, which is available in English. If you need any assistance with any tech issues, drop a message in the chat box to the CBRC host at info. This webinar will be recorded or is being recorded and will be published with captions available in English only on CBRC's YouTube channel within the next week or two. A reminder that racism, transphobia, homophobia, sexism, and other forms of discrimination or hate speech, as well as intimidation and personal attacks, will not be permitted. Any instances will be addressed immediately by our team, and any participant who behaves in this way will be removed. We ask that everyone helps contribute to a safe, respectful, and inclusive experience for everyone, which includes respecting personal experiences, ensuring that we're sharing this space with all other participants. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's panel, Dr. TJ Salwave. You may know him as Travis. He has been an incredible advocate and ally to survivors of conversion practices in SOGIs, and a co-conspirator who has worked tirelessly in the ongoing work of ending conversion practices in Canada. TJ, pronouns he, him, is an associate professor of health sciences at Simon Fraser University in BC, and a social epidemiologist who has led surveys and interviews and presented research which contributed to the passage of Bill C-4, making conversion therapy a crime. TJ has subsequently worked with community and healthcare practitioner partners to ensure that the new law serves as a platform for educating the public and further marginalizing harmful conversion practices within healthcare settings. I will now turn it over to TJ to introduce our panelists for today.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It's an honor to be here. I'm really at a loss for words to express my gratitude to you, Jordan, for your leadership in this space. And I'm really pleased that we have an opportunity to bring the work and the learnings of this coalition to a wider audience today. I now have the pleasure of introducing our incredible panelists, colleagues that I've really enjoyed getting to know over the last few years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them before we move into our presentation. So let me start with you, Miriam. Miriam Manai is an Amazigh Muslim non-binary activist and researcher from Tunisia and a survivor of conversion practices. They have advocated for LGBTQI rights across the Southwest Asian and North African or SWANA region and co-founded the organizations Without Restriction in Tunis and Mubararat in Montreal. And Mariam is a board member of Agir Montreal and supports SWANA immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Thanks for being with us, Mariam. Pam Rocker is an activist, speaker, and writer. She's a certified DEIB specialist, the chair emeritus of Affirm United, a co-founder of the Queer Interfaith Coalition, and the director of Affirming Connections. She also has lived experience of SOGIs, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression change efforts in various forms, and has journeyed alongside folks who are survivors of conversion practices and SOGIs. Ben Rogers is an advocate, executive director of CT Survivors Connect, an advocate and survivor of conversion therapy in Canada. He works to build peer-led support systems for survivors and lead awareness campaigns, educational initiatives, and policy advocacy efforts. He played a visible role in the push for Bill C-4 and championed survivor-informed solutions through community engagement, federal and provincial partnerships, and the declaration of January 7th as the International Day to End Conversion Therapy. And Debbie. Debbie Owusu-Akcha is a first-generation Ghanaian Canadian queer woman and an award-winning feminist activist, community educator, and social justice advocate, dedicated to the liberation of all her communities. She is co-director of policy and advocacy at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And Debbie was the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity from 2020 until May 2024. Thank you so much for being here, Debbie. We've already heard from Jordan, and I'll just add that I can't think of a better project coordinator for this coalition project, and I'm so pleased you've brought us together. Last but certainly not least is Michael Quagg, who is executive director at CBRC. He is a survivor of religious-based conversion practices and has also been an active and vocal advocate for the prevention and eradication of conversion practices in Canada. He's a longtime CBRC staff member who previously oversaw the organization's communications, knowledge exchange, and policy and public affairs initiatives. And we have a video from Rabbi Dr. Saritsky, who is unfortunately not with us today in person. They are a conversion therapy survivor as well as a second-generation Holocaust survivor. He is an ordained rabbi and therapist and a founding member of the Queer Interfaith Coalition. And so with that, Jordan, I'll invite you to give us a bit of background information for the webinar.
Hey, thank you very much, Travis. So if we could go ahead to slide 2. We're going to begin with some quick basic definitions and some comments on conversion practices and the IAAF project. So today, when we talk about conversion therapy practices, we're talking about a wide range of formal and structured psychological, behavioral, physical, and faith-based practices, treatments, or services that attempt to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, gender identity to cisgender, gender expression to match their assigned sex at birth. These efforts include claims that there are causes to people becoming queer, trans, or two-spirit, all based on an assumption that being heterosexual is the only normal way to express sexuality and that a person's gender identity always matches their assigned sex at birth. Conversion therapy is not considered a reputable form of therapy and has been widely condemned by professional organizations in Canada and around the world, which is why we use the term conversion practices. Next slide. SOGIs, which Travis has told you, stands for sexual orientation and gender identity or expression change efforts. So in addition to conversion practices, there are other ways in which people are pressured to change, deny, suppress, or lead a person to doubt their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. These subtle or blatant pressures or messages, which can be just as harmful as conversion practices, are known as SOGIs. They include formal and structured conversion practices, as well as the unstructured and informal practices, messages, or pressures. Many to us LGBTQI plus people who do not identify as a survivor of conversion practices will have experienced these types of change efforts throughout their lives. Next slide. So conversion practices and change efforts affect people's sense of self at their very core and promote a harmful or traumatic self-image. Long-term impacts include shame, depression, anxiety, social phobias, substance use disorders, homelessness, suicidality, complex trauma or PTSD, developmental trauma, religious trauma, sexual and relationship problems, low self-esteem or worth, fear of rejection or abandonment, and much more. These impacts are amplified for survivors who experience intersectional stigma that accrues over time, resulting in long-term health deficits. Trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse peoples often do not consider their negative experiences with medical or mental health care practitioners to be conversion practices. And young people, we know, are most susceptible as they seek to develop their sense of self, influenced heavily by family, peers, or other authority figures. When trying to identify if a practice, treatment, or service shares the ideology of conversion practices, it's important to focus on the objectives of the activity rather than how a practitioner describes it. Next slide. So I just want to take a minute to introduce you to CBRC's Intersectoral Action Fund project to establish a coalition to end conversion practices in Canada. This year-long project was an intentional extension of CBRC's research and interventions to facilitate increased collaborative action on preventing and ending conversion practices in Canada. The project built off of CBRC's many projects, which you can find listed in the research section at stopconversionpractices.ca. The project mobilized new and existing partners led by survivors and included 2S LGBTQIA plus community organizations, academics, researchers, legal experts, mental health care organizations, and affirming faith groups, to lead work across 3 priority action areas: partnership development, community and stakeholder education, and legal research and policy analysis. Next slide. So this is a list on this slide of the partners intersectorally who came together to serve on the project's advisory committee over this past year. And it's important to notice that 63% of the members identified as having lived experiences of conversion practices and or SOGIs. It has been an honor to work alongside these people who have and are continuing to do important work in their own contexts toward ending conversion practices and supporting survivors. You'll find a list of these folks on the stopconversionpractices.ca website in the coalition section. So next slide, what has the IAF project actually achieved over the past year? Well, we're excited and we're happy with the work that's been done. It was a 12-month project, extended 3 months more, so 15 months. We've been working with the Coalition Advisory Committee and those who continued with us during the 3-month extension. Over the past 15 months, we've strengthened and expanded collaborations between 2S LGBTQI plus community organizations, service providers, and key stakeholders led by people with lived experience and intentionally centering those who are underserved, so BIPOC, trans, newcomers. And all of this work has created a strong foundation for establishing a coalition that is truly inclusive and intersectional, which is not to say we're there perfectly. We are a work in progress. We consulted with and learned from CBRC's Two-Spirit staff during the project and engaged with finding from CBRC's qualitative project understanding experiences of conversion therapy practices amongst BIPOC, immigrant, newcomer, and refugee 2S LGBTQI plus people. We collaborated with Egale Canada to conduct a legal and policy analysis on the federal law and other anti-conversion therapy legislation and policy introduced to date in Canada to inform the project. We held a one-day in-person meeting in conjunction with Summit 2024, which was nice to all actually meet one another in person. And we engaged in some community building practices, and we worked on coalition building and visioning, where we created the coalition's vision and mission statements, values, and goals. Next slide. So project deliverables included blogs, a legal and policy analysis by Egale, and its report, as well as a policy brief, fact sheet, explainer, and this webinar. The 3-month project extension from April to June of this year was granted, which allowed us to focus on the challenges associated with sustainability and funding, identifying volunteers who can continue to engage in the work of coalition building. And we have extended invitation to leaders in the survivor community and to Two-Spirit organizations, knowing that their presence is critical to this work of building a coalition and connecting the coalition within the larger work of truth and reconciliation and decolonization. We will be looking to hire a short-term fundraising consultant to research funding opportunities among the charitable philanthropic sector and among the private foundation sector in Canada to support the work of the coalition. And later, you'll hear more about the ongoing coalition building work and how you can get involved. But for now, I will turn it over to TJ and Michael to share learnings from the legal and policy analysis conducted by Bennett Jensen and the folks at Egale Canada.
Thanks, Jordan. We're going to talk a little bit about briefly, because I think really the most exciting part of this webinar is hearing from our panelists who've been involved with the coalition. But we want to briefly set the stage by talking about the law. What does it entail? What are some other legislative mechanisms for preventing, deterring conversion practices in Canada? And then, of course, we want to comment on the limitations of the federal law and what are our recommendations for next steps. So I'll speak first and then pass it to Michael. Next slide, please. So I think most of you know by now that in 2020, the Canadian federal government first introduced legislation to officially criminalize the practice and promotion of so-called conversion therapy. And this sent a powerful message to acknowledge the harms that survivors have experienced and continue to experience, condemning any efforts to change, deny, or suppress the sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression of 2S LGBTQIA+ people. The law that we have now was introduced as legislation in 2021 as Bill C-4, and it came into effect on January 7th, 2022. And this followed efforts at provincial and municipal levels to ban conversion practices, which I'll comment on in a moment. One of our biggest concerns always has been that politicians in particular, but also community leaders, members of the public, healthcare practitioners will think, okay, this is illegal, and so it's all resolved and done. And we really want to push back against that dangerous narrative. So while criminal prohibition of conversion practices is an important step in addressing some of the most visible forms of conversion practices, these discredited and harmful practices persist across the country, and they impact our communities in profound ways. And so we certainly need more work, not only to end conversion practices, but to support survivors and our communities at a time when anti-2S LGBTQIA+, and particularly anti-trans and transphobic rhetoric is on the rise. So let me comment on the federal law. As a result of the passage of this law, the criminal code includes now 4 offenses that relate to so-called conversion therapy practices, which are punishable by fines or prison time, depending on the severity of the offense. These include causing a person to undergo conversion therapy, removing a child from Canada to another country to receive conversion therapy, promoting or advertising conversion therapy, and receiving financial or other material benefits for providing conversion therapy. Next slide, please. Um, Beyond the federal law and before the federal law was even contemplated, we did have provincial actions in Ontario, Nova Scotia, PEI, Quebec, and Yukon. And these provincial bans vary from province to province or territory to territory, but typically include banning conversion practices through regulations that are in the purview of a province or territory, such as healthcare regulations. So, for example, they might designate conversion practices as a non-insurable health benefit. They might prohibit health professionals from administering conversion therapy. There are a lot of other legislative mechanisms that provinces could and should pursue, and I think important to note that all of these provincial actions were happening before the federal government passed the law, and since the federal government passed the law, we have not seen meaningful changes at the provincial or territorial level, which again points to what I said earlier about the risk that having established this as a federal criminal offense, other political leaders now think that they don't need to take further action. And then lastly, we have seen municipalities, particularly in Western Canada, at least 14 in total that have enacted bylaws prohibiting business licenses to those who enact conversion practices. No one level of legislative action is in itself going to be fully effective. There's no silver bullet. We expect and we should demand that multiple levels of government take action. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a moment to contemplate what criminalization has achieved. We're going to talk, Michael and I will talk a bit about the limitations of the ban, but let's do acknowledge what we've been able to do as a result of the community mobilization and survivor-led efforts surrounding the ban. So number one, we have raised awareness and we've built community. And I think of course, we wish that we had reached even more people. We ran a survey in Canada right after the ban in 2022 with queer and trans youth, and we're disheartened to see that only 50% of the young people we surveyed actually knew that it was a crime to perpetrate conversion practices in Canada. Nonetheless, there's no doubt that the level of awareness of both understanding the varied nature of conversion practices, like Jordan was explaining, it's really hard to put a line around exactly what these practices are. So that understanding, and then also just an appreciation that these practices continue in Canada, despite a narrative that we have somehow eradicated anti-2S LGBTQIA plus practices. That awareness is a true achievement that we should recognize, and that is really the result of survivors really bravely speaking out in the lead up to the passage of the federal law and continuing to speak out and share their stories thereafter. And that includes several of the people on the panel here. I should note that Jordan mentioned the CBRC study looking at conversion practices post-ban in racialized and immigrant communities. And it does seem like that level of awareness and understanding of what is and isn't conversion practices is not as great in those communities as we would like. So there's still a lot of work to be done. The other thing that the ban did, which is really quite different from the previous federal actions to add sexual orientation, gender identity, expression to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is that it sent an unequivocal message that our state understands that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with our identities and our expressions and our being. It basically said that practices that start with that premise that Jordan was talking about, that there is something inherently flawed about who we are, is just not right. And it's actually at odds with Canadian values. And that was a really powerful message. Next slide, please. So this here credit fully goes to our colleagues, Bennett Jensen and Eric Freeman at Egale, the legal team there, with huge appreciation for all of the work they've done, including the review that Jordan mentioned, trying to understand where we're at right now with legal and legislative action. So we haven't seen much enforcement of the federal law, and so we should reflect on, well, why are we maybe not getting that? And there's a few significant barriers to accessing justice and enforcement. So the first is that at the pre-reporting stage, reflecting back on what Jordan was saying about how difficult it is to identify what is and is not conversion practices, do those who experience these practices, can they actually identify it and connect it with the definition of conversion therapy that's in the federal law? That's the first hurdle to overcome if we want to see enforcement and access to justice. And then at the reporting stage, we know that queer and trans, not to mention Black, immigrant, racialized communities, Indigenous communities, quite rightfully have a distrust of law enforcement and the and that if they go to the RCMP or other law enforcement, that they will take these claims seriously and actually investigate conversion practices when they're happening. So that's a second hurdle. And then the third, which is something we know from others who've sought justice, for example, experiencing gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, that there is a really high bar for establishing criminal conduct. A lot of the evidentiary burden falls upon the survivor themselves, and there's not anonymity in that process. So a third reason why we might expect that people are not achieving the level of justice they deserve with the federal law. Next slide, please. On the side of the practitioners, we would hope that the law itself would deter them from continuing these practices. But we know, particularly from a history of about 15 years of conversion practice bans in the United States, that practitioners do have a tendency to relabel, mislabel their practices in a way that do not align with the strict definition of conversion practices in the federal law. And so I suspect we're not seeing the levels of deterrence in practice that we would have hoped for. We could imagine and hope that there would be a normative. This would be an indirect effect of the ban. In other words, referring back to what I said earlier about that unequivocal endorsement of the wholeness of our identities and beings as queer and trans two-spirit people, that maybe other practitioners would basically respond to this signal that we should actually think differently about 2S LGBTQIA plus identities. And that's something that has yet to be evaluated. It's a hope more than it is, I fear, a reality, particularly when we think about the backsliding that's happening in our political landscape in North America, including Canada. And here I'm really thinking about an important connection between the federal definition of conversion practices and the anticipated effects of anti-trans laws that have been passed and enacted in Saskatchewan and Alberta. These laws create environments, in particular in classrooms and healthcare, that will systematically deny the identities of trans people. These are forms of identity invalidation that will occur en masse. I think we should start to think about how these are, in fact, conversion practices that are happening systemically due to legislation passed by lawmakers in those provinces. Within the coalition, Jordan mentioned our in-person gathering last fall. We've had discussions about how important it is now to shift our attention to these legal battles, acknowledging that they are part and parcel of the same larger socio-political threats constituted by conversion practices. So I am going to, next slide, please. I am going to now turn it over to Michael to talk about where we go from here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Travis, for I think a really great rundown of many of the important findings that were unpacked in the legal and policy analysis that was produced by Egale. I do want to echo the gratitude and thanks that Travis expressed to our amazing colleagues and collaborators at Egale, specifically Eric Freeman and Bennett Jensen, who sort of led all of the work and collaborated with our team, our advisory committee on the development of this report. I do encourage everyone to check it out. It's available on CVRC's website. But very quickly, I'm just going to try and run through some of the important recommendations which were mapped out in the report. And th these are kind of a bit more specific to addressing the different gaps and issues sort of that were identified in the policy analysis. I do, after kind of going through these, just kind of want to quickly speak to some other sort of ways in which we could be thinking about strengthening efforts to eradicate conversion practices in Canada. So the first being education and training for key groups, and just recognizing how essential it is for medical and mental health professionals, as well as faith organizations and law enforcement and other professionals to receive the training that they need to understand and recognize conversion practices and to be able to fulfill their legal obligations. Secondly, additional research to better understand impacts and gaps. Um, Ongoing research is needed to assess the efficacy and impacts of the various criminalization measures that that have been put into place to end conversion practices. And specifically, we need more research to better track where when, how conversion practices are happening, and just having a better understanding of the prevalence amongst different demographics of 12 LGBTQI plus people. Thirdly, it's thinking about how we can actually improve the quality of the first point of contact for survivors, recognizing, just how challenging and fraught with issues. Uh, Engagement with any law enforcement is for folks in queer communities, Black and Indigenous and racialized communities, and so thinking about what's needed to kind of provide knowledge and information about conversion practices, a centralized location to report on and track conversion practices where they might be happening, as well as, easy access to information about, how to access support for survivors. Um, Fourth, looking at making psychotherapy a regulated medical profession. So currently, counseling and psychotherapy are not regulated in most provinces, and this is the call that provinces should be establishing professional bodies to be setting some authoritative standards and guidelines that provide some accountability in relation to conversion practices. Fifth, require reporting and accountability from government. And so recognizing that the federal, provincial, and municipal entities that are tasked with actually enforcing the criminal code, that they should be required to disclose the steps that they're taking to actually enforce the law, including the training that's recommended in number one. Um, um, Next, exploring paths for deterrence through the CRA, and a specific recommendation that um, um, that charities that are suspected to have links to conversion practices that they're reported for non-compliance to the CRA as participating in criminal activity could threaten the charitable status of an organization. Reports to the CRA can be made anonymously, and the risk of losing tax benefits could be an important deterrent. Seven, urging provincial governments to produce cross-departmental plans to end conversion practices, as was done in Quebec back in 2023. Provincial governments can, when compelled to, adopt action plans to better address conversion practices within their sphere of government. So to kind of stimulate some action on identifying education, the collection of data on the prevalence of conversion practices. And yeah, so I think these recommendations, which were really targeted to the issue or the question of making criminalization actually work and to respond to the specific and direct legal and policy gaps that are associated with the federal conversion therapy ban. But as unpacked by TJ, it's really clear that this approach is fraught with challenges. The benefits, have there have been some important benefits like increased awareness and understanding. Um, those benefits may also be limited, mixed, and or uncertain with regard to their effects in the eradication of conversion practices. And also just, recognizing how difficult and drawn out it might be to see meaningful changes in the different recommendations that have been mapped out here. So therefore, I just think it's really important that we continue to think beyond criminalization about other ways in which we could be supporting the work to prevent and eradicate conversion practices, and remind ourselves and policymakers that at the end of the day, what we're really most interested in is making sure that queer, trans, and two-spirit people have access to affirming support. And, that is support that is safe and accessible, especially for folks who don't have access to this kind of support for their gender identity or sexual orientation in their lives. The kind of support that can offer a reprieve, an alternative for someone who is facing pressure from their family or faith community to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. And also, support that can help connect these folks to other queer and trans people in their community, including some who may have shared or similar experiences around conversion practices or SOGIs, and someone who can or different folks who can provide additional support around their experiences, and just kind of managing any sort of attempts by folks in their lives to conceal, suppress, or deny their identity or experience. Because the recommendations I just kind of spoke to on strengthening the legal and policy framework for criminalization, all of this is really important and necessary. They are, I think it's important to keep in mind, really about improving the criminal and legal infrastructure for the federal ban, and less about the ways in which we can and should be engaging with health and social systems to have a more meaningful impact in not only preventing conversion practices, but just in the way of providing better support for survivors and people who might be impacted by conversion practices. And so I think in concrete terms, this is about ensuring that frontline programs and services for queer and trans people at risk of conversion practices are that these are more widely available and accessible, including or perhaps especially for people who are in a family or in a community context where they may be experiencing barriers to accessing those kinds of affirming services. Um, I, I do want to sort of like wrap this up and turn it over to our panelists, but this is a shout out to the critical, painstaking, resource-intensive work that so many frontline 12 LGBTQI plus organizations do every day to ensure that queer people in their community are able to have access to support. And sometimes, or just the recognition that sometimes this experience of being in an environment that's invalidating of your sexual orientation or gender identity or expression is still all too common. So if speaking to these specific legal and policy recommendations feels a little bit outside of your comfort zone, I just want to remind folks that, that continued investment in affirming frontline, low barrier services for queer and trans people is a priority for ending conversion practices and surgeries. On my next slide, I just want to very quickly direct folks to some of the resources that Jordan spoke to earlier. And this includes the legal and policy report that our colleagues at Egale had drafted, as well as some related resources, including a policy brief, fact sheet, and explainer. So with that, I think uh, I will pass it back over to you, Jordan.
Travis, do you want to just say a few words?
No, I think Michael's covered it well. So,
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant about the question and answers.
oh,
Yeah,
yes, yeah, we have some great questions that I've been reading and reflecting on. We will answer those at the end of the webinar after we've heard from the panel.
right. Thank you, TJ. Okay, so what is it with this coalition? Is there one? Have we created one? The answer is basically no, not yet. Hang in there. The project for the year was to actually create the coalition. And so I'm just going to briefly go over a couple of the pieces of what this coalition is about. So the purpose of the coalition is to mobilize efforts to end conversion practices in Canada, to solidify and expand LGBTQ advocates working in this area, and to coordinate efforts for maximum social impact on Canadian legislation, policies, and community mobilization. So the coalition will be the place where we can come to talk about what we're doing, to build relationships, to share challenges and barriers that we are experiencing in our work, to learn from new perspectives, and to share information and resources. Next slide. Clearly, defining who is doing what in this area is one of the most important things that we can do to support coalition engagement. So as we learn more about who is doing what, identifying potential partnerships and new ways of working together will become clearer. We had hoped to launch the coalition earlier this year, but due to the challenges associated with sustainability and funding, we are holding off on the official launch until funding can be secured. Next slide. Next slide, sorry. So while the IAF project has now come to a close, the coalition building work will continue. Over the next few months, CBRC will continue to coordinate meetings, quarterly meetings, and keep communication avenues open. We'll continue to look for funding opportunities to support the work of the coalition. We'll continue to invite key individuals and organizations to join the work of coalition building. And we'll work with volunteer members to finalize what coalition membership will look like. And I stress right now with the extension, folks that you've heard from today and the folks that have been involved with us for the last 3 months have done so on a volunteer basis. And until we get funding, that's the way it's going to be. So once we have secured funding, we will officially launch the coalition with an open call for members and a media release. Next slide. So now is where we get to hear from the panelists, from the folks who have participated in the project and are continuing to work with us on coalition building, to engage in a conversation about diverse perspectives. So if we could shut off the slide presentation, thank you. And just highlight our panelists, we can begin. And I just want to mention, as TJ mentioned earlier, Sandra Carbone, who was to speak to the Francophone perspectives, is unable to join us today, but we know she's with us in spirit. And we will address, I know there was a question specifically about that. We'll address that during the Q&A. So welcome, Debbie, Ben, Mariam, and Pam. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. So we all been working with each other in different ways and forms over the past few years. But could I begin by asking you, to each state, what is the unique perspective that you are speaking from today in this conversation? So we all have all sorts of different identities and perspectives we can speak to, but folks have been asked to speak to specific perspectives today. So I'll just let you share that. to begin with. So Debbie, if you could lead off.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today this afternoon. And shout out to the folks at CBRC for convening this space. I'm excited to be chatting with you folks and also with some of my colleagues who I had the privilege of working with alongside this committee and coalition. But to answer the question, and I'll be quick because I can go on forever, if it's not obvious or if it has not been shared already, I'm coming into this conversation as a cisgender, queer, Black femme, specifically a Black femme who is from Ghana. So my family is from West Africa. I was born in Canada, but I was raised in a very large, tight-knit Ghanaian community in the Greater Toronto area and was, by virtue of that, given the privilege of being fully immersed in a working class immigrant community. If you've never been to Brampton, you'll know exactly what I'm talking. Like the image of it stands out. It is a privilege to have grown up there. But with that has come an interesting lived experience for myself, but also for many others who, by virtue of both our queerness and our cultural identity, are navigating systems of oppression in different spaces. And so when it comes to things related to conversion practices, I'm coming to this conversation from the perspective of someone who's often had to see or not see herself discussed on issues pertaining to us LGBTQ people. And as someone who's become an advocate on this, it has become my duty to ensure that other voices and experiences are at least centered in the conversation, because otherwise, and this is history has shown, primarily if white LGBTQ people experiences are centered and highlighted, for those of us who are racialized, who are watching and seeing those messages, we're forced to put our lived experience like in connection to that. And that creates a level of isolation that I think, especially as we're talking about survivors and healings and traumatic experience, we don't want to further isolate people as we're talking about that process, right? And so I've made it my duty to make sure that in this space, in this conversation, but also for future advocacy, is that we don't lose sight of the different perspectives that are needed in order for there to be a wholesome approach to future advocacy. So, a little bit about who I am, why I'm motivated to do this, and the insights I want to make sure are still top of mind.
Thank you, Debbie. Ben, what perspective do you bring?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Ben Rogers. I am the executive director of CT Survivors Connect. I am a survivor of conversion therapy practices. I went through a church here in Ontario, Canada. So the perspective I'm bringing is definitely that of a survivor, of a peer support person, and someone who has been trying to do everything I can as a survivor and just simply as a person to try to support other survivors and make sure that, the things I went through, end and other people don't have to go through it. I've gone through a lot of trauma and a lot of things through my life. I've been diagnosed CPTSD, ADHD, a few other letters of the alphabet. And a lot of it stems from the trauma and the experiences that I went through when I was younger and through CT as well. So, yeah, knowing what I've been through and knowing what I am able to do now, I am a voice that is going to continue to protect people as much as I can. And that means ending conversion therapy across Canada and across the globe.
Thank you, Ben. Miriam, if I ask you to go next, what perspective do you bring?
Hi everyone, bonjour. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here with you all, and thank you everyone who have joined the webinar. I'm speaking to you from Kanyangahaga nations and territories, so-called Montreal. So I'm here bringing the perspective of, first of all, refugees and asylum seekers in Canada and the migrant communities with a specificity of the Swana communities. And honestly, like the my involvement within the the committee is like coming from really personal story or journey, and I'm deeply committed to the creation of this national coalition to end conversion practices. I'm sorry, sometimes like I want to sneeze, but it's not coming out. So sorry about that. Allergy seasons is killing me. So it's because I witnessed myself, and I've been through those practices, and I've witnessed firsthand the devastating impacts of these practices. Uh, they could have, especially on racialized, queer, and trans people from different faith-based communities. In my case, the Muslim communities, and in general, the diaspora communities. And it also come um, from my work as an organizer, as a peer supporter, and as a part of the advisory team, um, and also from my own experience in supporting survivors, and many of whom has faced these harmful interventions in either institutional settings or within families, in other times in some informal networks, cultural or religious communities. So for me, I think this whole topic of ending conversion practices, it really requires a nuanced, community-rooted, survived, informed approach, which I'm very happy and thankful and grateful to see that the coalition is going towards that path, and that also can move beyond the symbolic legislative victories. And I believe that the national coalition can be really a powerful platform to center the lived realities of the most impacted members of the LGBTQI communities, and to build resources and some support system that can truly and genuinely culturally and spiritually grounded, and of course to advocate for policies that reflect the different complexities of how conversion practices manifest in Canada, and hopefully that would extend elsewhere around the world. And it's I think it's not just about the banning. It's about collectively building the conditions in which queer and trans uh, people in general, and most specifically the most marginalized ones, can thrive, heal, and be affirmed in all their different, beautiful, and complex identities.
Thank you, Miriam. Pam, what is your perspective on the coalition, and where do you speak from today?
So, yeah, thanks, Jordan. My name is Pam Rocker. I'm the director and founder of Affirming Connections and co-founder of the Queer Interfaith Coalition. And I grew up in a very fundamental conservative evangelical home in Texas, and really saw how much religion can be used both to create a sense of community and meaning and rootedness, as well as really promote toxic ideologies that queer identity and faith identity can't go together. And so a big part of my professional work has been working with queer folks and their loved ones in knowing that they can, queer folks can be all parts of who they are, including practicing whatever faith is meaningful to them. Because I have seen so much how this thing that is so important and so deeply rooted in many of us, our spirituality, has been used against us in our own communities to make us question who we are and make us try to, change who we are, even though that's not possible. And so I've always been really passionate about making sure that folks who I work with know that they can be all of those things. And I really think that exposing these toxic ideologies that lead to conversion practices is going to help us, create more opportunities for discussion and for affirming people and affirming faith communities to be able to be a lot more loud that there are places that you can belong and that you can practice your faith where you don't have to fracture yourself in order to belong. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I think being part of this group that is talking about building and forming this coalition has made me realize that I'm not alone, that there are so many folks across Canada and beyond who are doing amazing work in lots of different sectors. I mean, I have one that I'm, a specialist in, but that's one of many different sectors. And so I do believe that it's going to take all of us, and that there are so many folks that we don't even know who are doing similar work, that we can come together and really take a big chunk out of these harmful practices that still continue to be prevalent. And one last thing that I think is really important, as we've done this work to ban conversion practices, both here locally in Calgary on a municipal level and the federal ban, it became really, really clear to me that a lot of folks see conversion practices as what we see in the movies, right? Mm-hmm. In stuff like Boy Erased, and things that are, very huge and very overt, where people are being sent to camps, or, they're really being inundated in something where they're taken away from their, everyday lives. But it's not always like that. Your neighborhood church probably has some form of program. There's lots of different curricula that are across Canada that are sold to basically run 12-step-like programs to try to change folks' orientations and gender identities. So I think having stuff like these coalitions are going to help us not only be able to stop the practices, but for everybody to realize what they look like, because modern practices look different. And we need to know what they look like in order to be able to note them, report them, and for them to actually be eliminated. So for me, coming from this queer faith perspective is both, hard because I see how much something that is so important to me is used in such a, deeply wrong way. But also I see the possibility that we have as people of faith to really unlock the liberation for so many people. So yeah, I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Okay. I think I've kind of through the panelists a little bit. I asked for the perspective, and we got into a lot of things. So one of the questions that was going to ask was how you see the work of a coalition being helpful in your context. And you sort of answered that in many ways. You've talked about why you're committed to this work, but I want to make sure we leave time for the Q&A session. But let's just take a few more minutes. Are there specific things that you'd like to share you haven't had an opportunity to share yet about the coalition, about coalition building, about what you hope for its future once it's actually officially launched? What do you want to see happen? And just jump in there at any point. I won't pick on you.
I don't mind going first. That's okay. Oh,
thanks, Ben.
Nope. Debbie, I saw you here. You
No,
can go.
you go ahead. You unmuted before me. Please do.
All right. So I wrote down a couple things just to kind of keep me on track because I have an ADHD brain, so I throw off easy. So in regards to why I'm passionate and committed to the creation of the work of a coalition to end the practices, one of my major things is community building. I've always believed in community building, and I believe that if we don't connect as community, what's the point in the work that we're doing? Because we're all going to keep doing the exact same things, and it's just going to end up going lower and lower, and we're going to drop the ball. That's all there is to it. if we build ourselves as a strong community, then we have the capability of developing a much stronger and shared knowledge and support system across Canada. And with that, we would have the capability of sharing that with other countries and literally getting CT to end everywhere, not just in Canada. And that's what we really have to understand, is that just ending it in Canada is not actually ending it. Because the reality is, if it exists anywhere else, it has not ended. So this coalition is a massive building point to being able to end it globally. So now we got to end it here, and that's what we're doing. With that, though, like I said, we have to make sure that we are shared in our knowledge and support systems, working together to make sure that the support for survivors is actually available and easy to access. So, going to the second question, how do I see the coalition being helpful in what I do directly as a peer worker, as a survivor? Is as a survivor, I think that this will hopefully make it so that information and community supports will be available and just simply easier to access across the board. As a peer leader, I think this will be a great way to connect leaders and support systems to make supports for survivors a lot more of a streamlined process, as well as a much better communication system for us as the leaders in general. As a person who is a peer support, I think this will make peer supports just more recognized and accessible across Canada. Um, for me personally, when it comes to the coalition, I kind of got brought in late. And initially, that felt a little off as a survivor and as someone who's been running support for survivors. But at the same time, it gave me time to build on the support work that I do to be able to come into this coalition ready to go and ready to show that peer work and peer leaders are just as important as the educated from university and whatever. Our lived experience, our duty to what we do is absolutely valuable and very, very important. We need to have survivor centric work, survivor informed work, and there needs to be survivor leaders.
Thank you very much, Ben. Debbie.
Awesome. I just wanted to say, Ben, thank you so much for what you shared, especially around the importance of this being able to build community. I 100% agree. And, I'll talk a little bit about what I think, for that question, what it could do, but also for me individually, like it's community building. Like I got to meet really awesome people through this process. And I think if there's anything that queer and trans people are able to do, it's to be able to build community in some of the most trying times. And boy, is community needed so much right now as we're facing more than just the challenge of an anti-to us LGBTQ backlash. We're facing interesting legislation changes that are happening quickly that are going to impact queer and trans people, including those who are migrants that we cannot lose sight on and that is going to require our solidarity. And yeah, community is huge. So I'm really happy that you brought that up. One thing that I have been thinking about too is I consider the work that I do my day job, like I'm a human rights practitioner in many ways, although I work in government relations and advocacy in sexual and reproductive health and rights. Human rights is at the forefront. And I think this is a perfect time to remind people that LGBTQ people are rights holders and are duty bearers, whether that's the state, the province, municipalities, they have a responsibility for upholding our rights. And the issue that we see with conversion practices is discrimination and inequality literally trying to get in the way of us being able to have access to the duty or our duly fought and sought out human rights. And I think a human rights approach going forward is going to create those opportunities for communities, but I would say across coalition, like across coalitions and across sectors. I think about the amazing opportunity there is for feminist advocates or reproductive justice advocates to be standing alongside those of us who do this work. Heck, some of us are also in both of those spaces, like myself, right? And when we think about the global context, so again, thank you, Ben, for mentioning that, because as a person who exists in multiple spaces across borders, if we aren't thinking about the global implications of this, and if we're not thinking about the transnational solidarity work that also is needed, none of this achieves the broader goal of wanting us to eradicate these all over the place, right? And so that human rights approach, that human rights focus is going to be an interesting tool to do that. And so We got to think about that when we're thinking about policy development, when we're thinking about programming development, even in our advocacy work. What are the rights that LGBTQ people deserve? Right to health, right to freedom of expression, all of these things that all humans deserve. It's about addressing those systemic barriers that people, through violence, which is what this is, it's a form of violence, try to prevent us from accessing, to force us into a particular box, and to change who we are and to remove ourselves from having access to community. And so those are the things I think about. I think about what that means for me as a human rights practitioner. And I think about what it means for the people who are looking for that type of community. Human rights can be the foundation for that.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah,
Um, Miriam and Pam, I'm going to ask if you could speak very, very briefly.
sure.
I want to give at least 15, 20 minutes for our Q&A so we can hear from the participants who are listening today. But is there any, highlights you want to just mention before we wrap up this discussion?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think a coalition is critical because I've been doing this work for 15 years and there's so many people that I've just met 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, who I wouldn't have met, other than being involved in this very group. And so I'm really, really thankful for that. And I think because there's so much sustained government sanctioned efforts, I can say in Alberta and in other provinces, to remove all social visibility of 2S LGBTQIA folks, to remove gender affirming care, to add to a social stigma that is a form of SOGICE, like where you don't want to share who you are and you're penalized and you have consequences for being who you are. It's so important that this is something that's throughout all sectors of society because we are specialists in North America at exporting homophobia and transphobia and those sorts of things. And so unless we change ultimately our culture in how we and not viewing being queer as something other and something that's negative, we need to change that fundamentally. So that way it's not just the practices that we can see on the outside that change, but the whole attitudes of seeing each other, every single other person, as a whole person and not as anything to fix. And it's going to take all of us to be able to do that.
Thank you, Pam. Miriam, any final words?
Well, I I honestly have a lot to say, but I try to be as precise as possible. Um, well, I'll just bring the queer and trans Muslim perspective to add to what my colleagues have been sharing. So, too often the queer and trans Muslims, especially here in Canada, are left out of the conversation. So we're either painted as victims who need saving from our communities, or we're completely erased altogether. But the fact of existing as Muslim and queer and trans, it like we've always existed this way. So I think the coalition can be the space where our truths are centered and our genuine identities and whole identities are celebrated. And it can be that space where we're not forced to choose actually between being queer and being Muslim. And so many conversion practices, and you all know that target Muslims don't look like what the mainstream imagines. So, as they happen often through spiritual manipulation, isolation, shame, they are rooted in love that's conditional. And that can be even more damaging than violence can be named for it. So I think the coalition, specifically for the queer and trans Muslims, can help them reclaim their rights to be whole, and it can also help them create tools, raise awareness, education, and support networks that come from within our different communities and not specifically imposed from outside. And I think most importantly, as Pam was just saying, it can also show us that our lives are really sacred and that we don't need to be fixed, and that faith and queerness or faith and transness can really coexist in harmony and not in contradiction. And like, just to say a few words about how I see really the coalition being helpful for my communities is the fact that for me, I see it from my own experience as someone who had to flee my country because of who I am, because of the work I was doing and that I'm still doing. So I still carry the weight of the many layers of trauma, migration, exile, and rejection. So, and I know from getting in touch with um, the different coalition uh, uh, colleagues involved in this amazing work, I know that I'm not alone. And so many immigrants and refugees, they arrive to Canada hoping for safety and only to find that violence keep following them within community, within services, in shelters, like and even sometimes like in some forms of shapes of silence of systems that don't understand or see us as whole. So I think in this way the coalition matters so much for our communities, and it can help build responses that actually reflect our lives, that are multilingual, that are culturally safe, that are trauma informed, and led by people who get it. Means the people who really went through this or who have beloved people around them who went through this. So I really want that this work to reach those of us who feel invisible and those of us who really cannot have that privilege to be loud and to be out and speak about it publicly, and to say that we're not alone and you are not alone, and that we all deserve to heal in our own language, within our own culture, and like within our whole faith, and to be full safe effort. So it's really not, for me, it's really not a professional work. It's more of a survival work, it's more of a
Mm,
community work, and it's more importantly an ancestral work that
right.
we need to keep honoring by the time and by
Okay.
collectively reaching out to our communities.
Great. Thank you very much, Miriam. I know there's so much we all have to say. I'm going to try to share my screen so we can see the video from Rabbi Staritsky, and it's been a while since I've done this. Share sound, share screen. Let's see if this works. And please put into the chat if you don't hear
My
the.
name is Rabbi Dr. Nachshon Sritsky. Judaism teaches that every human is created in the divine image. In fact, Jewish teachings from 2,000 years ago assert that the gender diversity that exists in this universe reflects God's gender diversity. The original Hebrew word for God is Elohim, which is plural, to reflect the plurality of God. The first they pronoun can be found in the book of Genesis. The first human, according to the Hebrew Bible and ancient texts from 2,000 years ago, assert that the very first human was androgynous. Both male and female, he created them. And that truth has been lost. But 2,000 years ago, Jewish texts like the Talmud identified 8 genders. Alas, colonization and English translations have erased so much. Even many Jews have forgotten the most basic values inherent in our ancient texts. We talk about conversion therapy as something that queer people like myself experienced. And it is true, but it is so much bigger than that. Colonization is the ultimate conversion therapy. The merging of military and political force with organized religion is dangerous, and it can lead to indoctrination and other conditions that rely upon pseudoscience and hate. Sadly, the world seems to be repeating this tragic intergenerational trauma in so many terrifying ways. I am a second-generation Holocaust survivor whose grandfather survived medical experiments in Auschwitz, whose father survived the Nazis by being a hidden child like Anne Frank. I am transgender, and I learned to survive by hiding too. I underwent several types of conversion therapy, the first of which is the intergenerational trauma that taught me this, but then medical, psychological, religious, from both Catholic and Jewish sources, as well as structural forms. Even though Judaism believes in gender diversity, as I showed you and as you can see right here, even though that, many organized forms of Judaism do not acknowledge this historic fact, in large part because of the ways in which colonization has distorted the deepest spiritual truths that ought to guide us to treating every living being as sacred. I could speak more about this, but I only have a few minutes. I believe that when labels matter more than the breath of life that flows through us all, we are seeing the effects of colonization, of which conversion therapy is one particularly lethal and increasingly popular example. I say lethal because when we try to change who we were created to become, this is equivalent to trying to destroy our essence. And this is why conversion therapy and colonization, in my opinion, are sinful and dangerous, and why I joined the CBRC to try to educate more people about its dangers. Thank you.
Okay. I apologize. We've got 10 minutes for question and answers. I do want to just mention briefly that if you are involved in this work in any way yourself, personally or through an organization, there are ways for you to connect. So if you are interested in learning more about the coalition, if you're interested in joining the coalition building work, you can email me at coalition@cbrc.net, and you can ask to be added to an email list, so you'll get some communications, you'll hear about meetings, you can volunteer to participate in certain activities that are announced in email, and you can read the coalition overview, which contains the vision, mission, values, and goals, which will be on the Stop Conversion Practices site very soon. So I'm going to shut up and turn things over to TJ and have some few minutes at least for question and answer.
Thanks, Jordan, and thank you to all of our panelists for your really rich insights. And I especially want to appreciate the ways in which you're connecting this to broader reactionary movements that threaten the safety and well-being of a number of different communities, including newcomers, Indigenous people, people who are racialized, and people of color in Canada. We do have a few questions from our audience, and I'm really curious to hear what our panelists have to say in response. So the first question is asking if we have police or victim service statistics on folks reporting conversion practices. And this person also acknowledges that in the case of prosecution, it's probably still too early to get information because we know the legal system is incredibly slow. But we could, I think what they're suggesting is we could actually get police or victim service statistics. I haven't seen that, and I didn't see it in the Egale policy and legal analysis. And so if I could reframe this, to our panel, like, what do you think it would take for those people who are experiencing and surviving conversion practices to actually access some of the resources? I have seen the federal law being added to provincial victim support service programs, as trying to open the door to invite people in. But what else do you think it would take for people to access government supports and justice resources? And I don't have anyone in mind for this, so I'll just throw it out to all of our beautiful panelists to see who has a thought.
A safe reporting system in and of itself. As a gay, as a queer person, as a two-spirit person, as a survivor, I can very much say that police have not been the safest for me, particularly when there were police officers that served in the church that I was put through my CT in. So it's like, okay, so I'm going to go to the police and talk to the officer who was standing in the room when this all happened to me. Like, these communities are very tight knit, and having an actual safe and accountable support, like reporting system, is very much needed. And unfortunately, we don't have that. We also don't really have an accountability system across the board.
Thanks, Ben. Hear, hear. Any other thoughts on what it would take to get people accessing these supports?
Yeah, I can share that in Calgary a couple of years ago, we tried to test the municipal bylaw because there was a conversion practices author who was traveling through and was promoting his book and promoting churches and people to come. And it definitely, everything that it did fit the municipal bylaw in terms of violating the conversion practice ban. But then we found out when folks were calling the bylaw number, the bylaw officers had no idea actually what the definition of conversion practices were. So I think that training that was talked about that is needed, because they were like, well, nothing's happening at this conference. And I was like, advertising conversion practices is illegal, right? And they're like, well, we don't, like, it was just a mess. So even when we tried to sort of test the band to see if it worked, it didn't. And so we really need that education to those folks who are being reported to, so that when people take the risk, or even a loved one of someone who's experiencing it calls or tries to report it, they are believed and something happens when they call. So definitely the training of recognizing modern conversion therapy efforts, and that steps are taken so that folks can build some sort of trust, that it matters, that it is illegal, that something criminal is happening. So that's just an example of a real life example of us trying to test the municipal one. I don't know of any federal examples, but I'm assuming that the training that is needed is nationwide.
Thanks, Pam. Your comment reminds me, our legal colleagues, folks working in queer community organizations, are continuing to hear from people who are still experiencing conversion practices. So we know it's still happening. And I think really the issue is around how do we make a safer, more responsive reporting mechanism. I'm going to pivot to another question because it's quite important. Someone's asked for information and resources in French. Acknowledging that our session today has been entirely in English. Miriam, I wonder if you have any suggestions for this person?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think if Sandra was here with us today, she would have done this better than me. But I do believe that Fondation Emergence have been doing great work in French and specifically in Quebec. And I think that by visiting Fondation Emergence website, you'll find different information with that matter. Yeah. There are some other groups and organizations, smaller organizations that are trying to produce some information or educational tools in French, but I believe it's more of a capacity restriction for these groups to be able to really like share more and more information. And just to echo the other question and what my colleagues have been sharing, I think it's also important to mention that we still do not see very strict accountability measures to follow up on the victims of survival of conversion practices, and I think those are very much needed nationwide.
If
Thank
I can actually just touch in really quick there, TJ. There is some work being done on some of the local level here with regards to getting some French educational information that's going to be going out. We're working on pamphlets and we're trying to get our info cards done in French. So soon you'll be able to find on CT Survivors Connect's website some access to some French information and data. So.
Thank you so much. We're nearing the end of our time together, and so I'll just mention really briefly. The last question is about legal challenges um, posed by practitioners to the federal law. And this is a question I've asked Bennett before, and I think this would pre-require someone actually being charged with a crime, which we have not yet seen. But we know this is coming because the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case out of Colorado, a case that's brought forward by a very well organized anti-queer and trans religious organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom. And they are seeking to overturn all conversion therapy bans across the United States. And so we can expect similar challenges will come to Canada. And so I'm just wondering, particularly for panelists who haven't yet spoken in this last session, Debbie, Michael, Jordan, how do we prepare ourselves for the fight that we know we're going to need when it comes to potential attempts to overturn the federal law? Yeah, Debbie.
So this is an interesting question, and I think we are already facing some interesting challenges or kind of case studies for the bigger thing. And I'm going to speak to the provincial policies that we've seen in New Brunswick, which is currently being reversed because of the new government that's there, in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Some people would be like, oh, how are these policies about trans kids and their ability to use pronouns or gender affirming care for youth related to CT? I don't have enough time to do that whole storytelling, but I do believe they are connected. And those particular provincial situations, I think, are uh, the stepping stone for what could be like a federal Supreme Court case. So we have lessons that we can learn right now from the advocacy that's taking place in those provinces and to start building the necessary coalitions and connections to be best positioned to address this if it does go federal. We know that Egale has been involved in many cases provincially with local partners to address this. So, what can we then think about when it comes to getting legal folks involved, local organizations involved, etc., and our ability to monitor what's happening in the federal government? Things are changing real quick, and something like a borders bill or a bill related to one economy, people would be like, oh, why, what does this have to do with future threats? If a government gives itself permission to make sweeping changes without rigor, debate, and to give a minister the ability to change laws at whim, in the hands of a violent new government, what could happen? So these are just things that we need to keep in mind and monitor, but also like tap ourselves on the shoulder and the back for being like, there's work that's already happening that we can leverage for, I hate to say this, for the worst that could come.
Really well put. Thank you, Debbie. I think that's a good note to end on. Let me hand things over to Jordan to make some final remarks.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks for those of you who are still with us. I think the bottom line here is we know that there is a lot of work to do. Education training for so many different sectors and organizations is needed. Ways to support survivors, places to turn, recommend that survivors can connect to. Ben's been doing that work, and is wanting to grow and reach more people. So that's we're beginning. In many ways, we're beginning to address this. I've been aware of it since the 1970s. So the last 5 years have been absolutely incredible in addressing this issue, but we have a long ways to go. Coalition will be a very exciting way of keeping this work rolling along and growing and connecting us to each other. That's the most important thing. So thank you all for joining us today. We will have the recorded webinar available on YouTube. And I think that's it. So thank you to the panelists. I want to acknowledge before we close just how much I've learned, I think we collectively have learned around the effects of colonization and the effects of xenophobia, all the different ways that our identities have been attacked and are under attack. We've had members of our committee who have not been able to speak out publicly because of the danger to their lives and losing immigration or refugee status. So we're very much aware of those. So yeah, long ways to go. But thanks for joining us and thanks for being a part of this work.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.